Old man, are you deaf or just lost? Colonel Richard Vance's voice sliced through the air cold and sharp as steel striking tile. The waiting hall at Rammstein Air Base fell into sudden silence. Samuel Peterson looked up, pale blue eyes tired but untouched by fear. He didn't answer. He simply looked back. Vance strode closer, every step deliberate, his flight suit pressed to perfection. This seat's for real soldiers, not relics from a museum. A dry laugh slipped from his mouth like a stray bullet. The young airman beside him froze, a bottle of water trembling in his hand. No one spoke. Only the hum of the air conditioner remained, and the rhythm of authority in polished boots. Samuel finally replied, voice low, steady. I'm just waiting for a flight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded military ID, setting it gently on the table. The light caught it glinting across the colonel's eyes. The air grew heavy, thick enough that even a breath seemed loud. Before Vance could speak again, the sound of leather boots echoed from afar, measured deliberate, growing louder with each step. The entire waiting room stood still, frozen in a silent command of attention. A silence stretched tight like a wire before it snaps. If you believe that true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who've walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories, where we honor the memory, dignity, and silent valor of our forgotten heroes. Samuel remained still, no movement, no defense, no words. The midday light streamed through the window of Rammstein Air Base, glinting off the thin, weathered hands that held a faded military ID. The light passed through the yellowed edge of plastic, and in that reflection was an entire life that had long since closed its final chapter. Wind from the runway slipped through the cracks of the door, carrying the scent of jet fuel and metal dust, a smell only those who had lived inside a cockpit could ever understand. The gust brushed the flags along the corridor, making the fabric tremble softly. In the whisper of that wind, it was as if someone far away was calling his name. Samuel lowered his head slightly. His fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the ID card, a small gesture, heavy with a century of memory. The soft clang of the wind against the glass sounded like a whisper from the past. For a fleeting moment, the world shifted color. Time cracked open inside him, a flashback rushing in like a gust against the current. Rammstein disappeared, replaced by the burning orange glow of a C-130 cockpit, shuddering under a storm of flak fire. A voice screamed through the radio. "We're hit! Left engine's on fire!" Samuel didn't panic. His voice, low and firm, cut through the alarms. "Hold steady. We're not done yet." The plane shook violently. Streaks of light sliced past the windows, each one a blade against metal skin. Sweat mixed with blood. Smoke filled the cabin. The young co-pilot beside him, bleeding from the shoulder, kept his grip on the yoke, trembling but resolute. Samuel reached over, wrapped his hand around the pilot's, and pushed forward together. No fear. Only the measured breath of a man who had lived too long beside death. The C-130 tore through the haze. Below them yawned the Devil's Jaw Valley, a hell of fire and steel unmarked on any map. They had one choice: land or die together. Samuel's voice came one last time, steady as gravity hold. Steady. Then the vision dissolved. The sound of engines, gunfire, screaming, all were swallowed by a vast, empty silence. Back in the present, Samuel opened his eyes. Only the cold, white light of the waiting room remained, and the arrogant face of Colonel Vance. He inhaled deeply. No reaction, no defense. He simply laid the ID back on the table like an old ritual performed one last time, then stood still. His shoulders slumped slightly, yet his gaze held firm, as though behind that silence stood an entire squadron of ghosts. The room fell quiet again. The clock on the wall ticked slow and deliberate, echoing like a fading heartbeat. A few young airmen glanced his way, then quickly turned aside, uneasy. Vance stood motionless, hands in pockets, lips curled into the smirk of a man mistaking cruelty for control. Samuel said nothing. He exhaled softly, a breath that carried the weight of age and war. The sound stretched out long and thin, like waves brushing a shore of steel. The ID trembled in the wind, light glinting off a line of text, USAF, active duty, 1968. In that moment, he was no longer the quiet old man in the terminal. He was Hawk 8, the pilot, who had once flown beyond the line between life and death. Vance looked at him with disdain, blind to the truth that stood before him, a legend written in blood and iron. No one in the room knew that this man had once flown a burning aircraft out of hell just to bring his brothers home. And now he stood among the young, a man who once belonged to the sky, now only its shadow. In the corner, the wind rose again, and from afar Vance was about to speak words that would ignite the room once more. "Men like you are, why this country's soft. Colonel Vance's voice tore through the air like a blade. Every word landed hard and cold, echoing through the waiting hall of Rammstein Air Base, where silence hung heavy enough to suffocate. A few young servicemen in freshly pressed uniforms lowered their heads. One let out a nervous, brittle laugh, not out of amusement, but out of fear. The sound broke apart instantly, as fragile as paper. Samuel Peterson didn't respond. He bent down, picked up his old canvas bag. His thin body curved forward, hands trembling slightly. Yet in that instant, the light from above fell across his face, the light of dignity, something no insult could ever take away. Vance moved closer. His shadow spread over the old veteran like a dark stain. "What did you even do back then?" "Push papers, fix radios." His tone dripped with contempt. Behind the counter, a few young soldiers exchanged glances, trying to avoid their commander's eyes. No one dared to speak. No one even breathed too loudly. Samuel straightened slowly, as if every bone in his body had to remember what it meant to stand tall. He looked directly at Vance, his gaze calm as still water. Not defiant, not afraid. Only one thing remained visible, the quiet composure of a man who had looked death in the face and found nothing left to fear. Vance gave a dry laugh. "Come on, old man. Let's hear it. What did you really do?" The words hit harder than the echo of boots on concrete. Samuel stood silent for several seconds, a pause so deep that even the ticking of the wall clock became deafening. Then softly, he said the only words that mattered: "I served." 2 words, and the entire room froze. It wasn't just a statement. It was a command of dignity, simple, solid, unshakable. Vance hesitated, lips curling. "You served. That's it. You think that makes you special?" "Everyone served." He spoke as if trying to extinguish the light in another man's eyes, not realizing that same light was beginning to expose him. Samuel didn't flinch. He lowered his gaze, his frail hand gripping the worn strap of his bag. The sound of rough canvas brushing against the floor echoed like waves rolling against a hull of steel. The room stayed utterly still. Only the faint whistle of wind outside dared to exist between the 2 men locked in silence. And in the eyes of the younger soldiers around them, something began to shift. They looked at the old man not as a relic, but as a mirror reflecting something they had yet to understand. The true honor doesn't demand proof, it simply endures. Vance lowered his voice, his words cutting even deeper. "Your generation thinks the world owes you something. Well, it doesn't." Samuel remained silent. He closed his eyes, a gesture so subtle, so soft, yet it brought the entire room down a notch in breath. And in that silence, memory returned like a cold wind, the crackle of radio static, the thundering rotors, the voice of a younger self echoing through chaos. "Hold steady!" He opened his eyes. No tremor, no fear. That gaze alone made Vance falter, because for the first time he realized he was standing before a living legacy. A sergeant in the back glanced at the ID on the table, read the name Samuel Peterson under his breath, and instinctively straightened his posture. The others didn't understand why, but the air had changed. It was no longer obedience born of rank. It was respect, pure and instinctive, rising from the shared memory of service that still lived in their blood. Samuel inhaled deeply. His hand brushed the edge of the canvas bag where a faded silver insignia lay hidden, a piece of metal he'd never shown anyone. Light from the window struck it, glinting across the table, a brief flash of the past, just 1 second, but enough to change everything. And then from across the room, someone set down a coffee cup. The sharp crack of porcelain breaking split the silence like a signal that something long buried was about to awaken. "Then tell me, what was your call sign?" Colonel Vance's voice rasped, laced with mockery. Each word was a needle meant to pierce the silence that hung heavy over the waiting hall. No one answered. Only the wind outside whispered along the metal corridors of Rammstein Air Base, carrying the cold scent of jet fuel and steel. Samuel Peterson lifted his head. Light from the wide glass window washed over the deep lines on his face. The weariness was gone. In its place was the quiet focus of a man who had once flown beyond the edge of life. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, resonant, like a radio command from another time. "Hawk 8. The 2 words dropped into the air like a stone into still water. No one moved. No one understood. Then came the first sound, the sharp crack of glass shattering. A graying sergeant at the far end of the room froze his coffee cup, slipping from his fingers and breaking against the floor. The sound struck like a gunshot, clean, final, absolute. The sergeant didn't speak. He simply set the broken cup aside, straightened his uniform, and turned toward Samuel. Then he raised his hand in salute. No order, no prompting. Only instinct, the reflex of a man who had once heard that name whispered in missions that never made it into the records. Vance frowned, irritation creeping into his tone. What the hell is this? No reply. Across the room, heads began to lift. Confusion turned to unease. An older man in a civilian suit, a small paratrooper pin still on his lapel, slowly lowered his newspaper. His lips moved as if reciting a ghost hawk. 8. The air shifted. From scattered breaths came stillness. A wave of silent reverence rippled through the room, as though the name had awakened a collective memory buried too deep to forget. The young airman who had once tried to offer Samuel a bottle of water now stood motionless. His chest rose, posture straightened, a soldier's instinct, recognizing something his mind could not yet grasp. Vance tried to hold his composure. What kind of nickname is that supposed to impress me, Hawk? What he never finished. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. Not the stride of a clerk or aide, but the measured rhythm of command. It carried authority. Weight. History. The door swung open. White light poured in with a rush of cold air. Every uniform in the room snapped to attention, no orders given. A 4-star general entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes sweeping the room with quiet command. His shadow stretched long across the polished floor, stopping exactly where Samuel stood. Vance spun around, relief flooding his face like a drowning man spotting a rope. General Thompson, sir. I was just handling a situation with this civilian. But the words caught in his throat. The general's eyes had already found Samuel Peterson. A brief pause. Then his face froze, shock, disbelief, and something far deeper, reverence. The room seemed to drain of all sound. No voices. No shuffling. Only breath. General Marcus Thompson stepped forward. He passed Vance without a glance, walked straight to the old man in the faded flannel shirt, and stopped. Without a word, he raised his hand in salute, a salute sharp enough to cut through the silence. Everyone watched, disbelieving. A 4-star general of the United States Air Force saluting a tired, nameless veteran. Light from the window glinted off the silver ID card on the table, casting its reflection across both men's faces, the light of memory of truth finally called by name. In that moment, authority shifted hands, and what had been buried for half a century was about to come to light. The door to the waiting hall swung open. White light from the corridor spilled across the polished floor and caught the silver insignia on the jawline of a 4-star U.S. Air Force general. No one needed an introduction. Every man in the room recognized General Marcus Thompson, Supreme Commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe. His boots struck the tile in slow, heavy rhythm, each step a silent command. The air seemed to compress under his presence. Colonel Vance straightened instantly, snapping to attention, with a salute so quick it looked clumsy. General Thompson, sir. I was just dealing with a situation. This civilian was refusing to comply. He didn't finish. The general stopped. Thompson's eyes didn't land on him. They slid past, cold as a blade, until they met the man standing quietly by the window, the faded flannel shirt fluttering gently in the draft. For a moment, the world went still. The general's eyes widened, his breath caught. Then barely above a whisper, he said, "My God." Hawk 8. No one understood, but for those who had seen war, the name was legend. Vance blinked. Sir. Hawk what? No one answered. The general began walking forward. Each step echoed like a drum at a funeral ceremony. When only a few feet away, Thompson stopped, squared his shoulders, straightened his spine, and looked Samuel in the eye. Then he raised his hand. A salute, precise, sharp, reverent. Not a courtesy, a tribute, to a man who had once carried other men's lives on his wings. The room fell utterly silent. A sergeant who had dropped his coffee earlier raised his hand and saluted. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall stood rigid, hands at brows, a sea of salutes, aimed at Samuel Peterson. The sound vanished. Only Vance's heartbeat remained fast, uneven, choking inside his chest. He stared, trembling. A 4-star general was saluting the very man he had just humiliated. Samuel said nothing. He gave a small nod, his expression softening. And slowly, he returned the salute, a motion crisp and natural, as if discipline had never left his body. For a fleeting moment, they stood opposite one another, past and present glory and oblivion merged into one. General Thompson lowered his hand, his voice rough but steady. "Welcome home, Chief. It's been a long time." Samuel smiled faintly, a quiet smile like the last light of day. "It's good to see you, Marcus." In that instant, there were no ranks, no titles, only two old soldiers meeting again in a world that had moved on without them. No one dared to speak. A few young airmen bowed their heads as if witnessing a sacred ritual they were unworthy to interrupt. Light from the window cut across the floor, forming a long, golden path between the two men. In that light, Samuel's old shoes shimmered with a dust of silver, and the insignia on Thompson's chest caught the same metallic glow, past reflecting upon past. Vance swallowed hard, voice trembling. "General, who is he?" The question fell like a confession. Thompson turned eyes cold enough to cut through air. "Do you have any idea who you were speaking to, Colonel?" His tone was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 explosions. Vance stammered, "Sir, I didn't—" That man, the general, interrupted. Pointing to Samuel is Chief Master Sergeant Samuel Peterson. You might know him by another name, Hawk 8. The name struck the air like thunder. Not a label, a resurrection. A few in the room gasped. Others placed their hands over their hearts. The name they'd heard only in stories, the ghost of an era was standing before them. Vance's eyes went blank. Every trace of arrogance drained from his face. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he stepped back, unsteady, shaken to his core. The silence remained, but its color had changed. It was no longer fear. It was reverence, gratitude. General Thompson turned back to Samuel, his tone softening, rich with emotion. "We never stopped talking about you, Chief. Not a day goes by." Samuel nodded gently, a sad smile touching his lips. "I just did my job, Marcus. Nothing more." But Thompson knew. Hawk 8 hadn't just done his job. He had done what no one else dared to do, and the truth of that courage was about to be told. The room remained frozen, every eye fixed on the two old soldiers. General Marcus Thompson took one step forward. His voice filled the air, measured steady, needing no force. Yet every word struck the floor like a drop of molten steel. "Let me tell you who this man really is." The room seemed to tilt. No one dared breathe. He lifted a hand toward Samuel Peterson, the silver-haired man standing quietly by the window, his hands folded before him, eyes still on the reflection in the glass. In the late 1960s, Thompson began, there was a unit that didn't exist. No records, no patches, no glory. They flew deep into enemy territory, bringing home men who were never supposed to come back. He paused, drawing in a deep breath. Their lead pilot, the man who flew through storms of anti-aircraft fire and brought his crew home alive, was call sign Hawk 8. Vance froze where he stood. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Thompson continued. He flew the incredible sport, an AC-130 modified for missions so dangerous the Pentagon denied they ever happened. He tested rockets strapped to a cargo plane to rescue hostages. The aircraft crashed. He was burned over 60% of his body. 3 months later, he was flying again. The room seemed suspended between the present and the past. Samuel neither spoke nor nodded nor denied a word. Only the light from the window glinted off the scars the time had left upon his face, proofs that needed no words. Thompson's voice faltered for a heartbeat, then rose again, calm, resolute, like a eulogy. He flew into a place called the Devil's Jaw, a valley so deep, so heavily defended that we'd written off the men trapped there. But he went in anyway. One engine on fire. No air cover. He landed on a strip of dirt no longer than a football field under constant fire. And he brought every one of them home. Silence. Only the pounding of hearts filled the room. A few young soldiers blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. A sergeant clutched his cap to his chest, unaware that he had moved at all. Vance turned toward the general, his voice trembling. "Sir, you mean... He's the one from the Devil's Jaw report. I thought that mission was classified." Thompson cut him off. "Because we thought they all died. He was shot down 2 years later. Captured. Spent 4 years in a prison that didn't exist on any map. We declared him dead." The general lifted his head. His eyes glistened. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His family got a folded flag. The world moved on, but he came back, quietly. He refused to let his name be made public. He didn't want parades or medals. He just wanted peace. A cold breeze drifted through the room, brushing the flag in the corner. It swayed gently, reverently. The sunlight passed through the fabric and rested on Samuel's shoulder, a wordless ceremony for a man who had never asked to be honored. Thompson's voice dropped hoarse with emotion. He gave everything and asked for nothing. The entire room bowed their heads. No command, no order, just instinct, the kind that rises when men recognize something sacred. Vance lowered his gaze, shoulders trembling. Not from fear, from shame. The pride that once made him intimidating had drained from his face, leaving only the hollow eyes of a man who had seen his own smallness exposed. Samuel turned toward him. No anger in his eyes. No triumph. Only quiet understanding, the mercy of a man who knew that victory never came from humiliating others, but from preserving the goodness that war could not destroy. Thompson exhaled slowly, then spoke again, his tone sharp as truth itself. This man carried a generation on his back, Colonel. While you were polishing your wings, he was carrying men out of hell. Remember that the next time you wear that uniform. No one replied. The wind rose again, mingling with the thudding rhythm of hearts still recovering from what they'd just heard. In that moment, the entire room seemed to hold only two sounds, the melting of Vance's shame and the quiet dignity of a true hero. And as General Thompson turned away, he knew this moment was not the end. The truth had been spoken, but one thing remained, forgiveness, and the lesson it would leave behind for those who would follow. Night settled gently over Rammstein Air Base. A soft amber light spilled through the window of the VIP lounge where Samuel Peterson sat quietly before a cup of tea gone cold. Outside, the drone of aircraft engines rose and fell along the distant runway, the old familiar breathing of a world he once belonged to. A knock sounded at the door. Once. Then again. A voice followed, low, rough, almost afraid of itself. "Sir, may I come in?" Samuel looked up. In the doorway stood Colonel Richard Vance, upright, composed, but changed. The arrogance of the morning was gone. What replaced it was the humility of a man facing himself. His flight suit remained immaculate, but his shoulders carried weight. "Sir, I was wrong." The words came out shaky, but sincere. Vance stepped in slowly, removing his cap, holding it tight in both hands. "I spoke without respect, without understanding. I forgot what this uniform is supposed to mean." His voice broke at the end, catching in his throat. Samuel didn't answer right away. He simply studied him long enough that Vance couldn't bring himself to lift his eyes. The lamplight traced every crease on the old man's face. Each line a year of service, each scar an unnamed memory. Finally, Samuel spoke, his tone low, gravelly, but steady. "We all fail, son." He paused, breathing out softly. "What matters is what we do next." Vance lifted his gaze, eyes glistening. He searched for words, but all he managed was a whisper. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, sir." Samuel smiled faintly, a tired, kind smile. He rose slow and deliberate and stepped closer. Then he placed his thin, weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder. The touch was gentle, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "You'll make it right, son. Not with words, with how you lead." His gaze softened but held firm. "They follow your tone, not your orders. Remember that." Vance nodded, lips pressed tight. A single tear traced down his cheek, falling onto the glove in his clenched hand. Silence filled the room. Only the steady ticking of the clock remained, and the golden light that fell across two soldiers, one old, one young, standing face to face like two generations bound by the same oath. Samuel stepped back half a pace. "Now go, Colonel. Be the leader your men deserve." It wasn't a command. It was trust, the kind only those who have fought know how to give. Vance drew a long breath and stood at attention. "Yes, sir. I will." He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, holding it until Samuel nodded. At the door, he paused. Light caught the insignia on his chest, making it gleam like a promise. "Thank you, sir, for not giving up on people like me." Samuel's reply was barely more than air quiet, almost fading into the hum of the night. "That's what we fought for, so that people could become better." The door closed softly, leaving Samuel alone beneath the dim light. He turned toward the window where the night sky stretched wide, scattered with faint streaks of silver. Outside, the engines roared again, deep, steady, like the heartbeat of memory itself. He leaned back into his chair, hands clasped together. In that stillness, Samuel understood not every battle ends in the sky. Some are fought within the human heart, and only grace can make us victorious. The light dimmed. The music sank low, just a soft tremor of string was the sound of redemption and of faith passed on. And when dawn rose over Rammstein, something small yet profound awaited the legacy of Hawk 8, not etched in metals or stone, but in how others would live to carry his memory forward. The next morning, Rammstein Air Base awoke beneath the pale chill of the German sun. The call of the morning horn echoed across the runway. Wind rippled through the line of flags, the fabric beating slow and heavy like the heart of a soldier. No one spoke about what had happened the day before, but everyone knew something had changed. Inside the base's Hall of Honor, the faint scent of fresh paint lingered. Between rows of framed photographs, each one capturing a mission frozen in time, a new brass plaque had been mounted. Its inscription gleamed under the fluorescent light, cut deep and clear. In honor of Chief Master Sergeant Samuel Peterson, Hawk 8. He gave everything and asked for nothing. There was no ceremony, no band, no speeches, only a few pairs of boots echoing softly in the hallway, and a few glances that lingered longer than usual. A silent ritual fitting for a man who had lived his entire life in quiet service. The door opened. Colonel Richard Vance stepped in. His uniform was crisp, his cap perfectly aligned, his gloves spotless. He stopped in front of the plaque, standing motionless. His eyes traced the carved letters as if trying to etch each one into memory. Seconds passed. He adjusted his cap, then raised his hand in a salute. Slow, steady, flawless. Not for anyone to see, but for himself to earn the forgiveness he'd already been given. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Rest easy, sir. We'll carry it from here." No voice replied. But somewhere in the stillness, a soft breeze swept through the room, as if the air itself had returned the salute. Across from the plaque hung an old photograph, a C-130 cutting through a sky of fire. The fuselage was blackened with smoke, but it held its course, still flying straight. Beneath it, a fading caption read, "Devil's Jaw, all men returned home." Light bounced off the polished brass through the glass and reflected across Vance's face. He took a deep breath. His expression was different now, no arrogance left, only reverence. Outside, the young airmen were switching shifts. A newly assigned sergeant stopped his gaze, catching the plaque. He turned to Vance, his voice quiet. "Who was he, sir?" Vance's tone was calm, grounded like the voice of a storyteller passing down a truth. A man who never stopped serving, even when no one was watching. The young man nodded, eyes fixed on the inscription. Then silently, he straightened and saluted. In that simple gesture, the legacy lived on, not in words or promises, but in quiet action. As evening settled, the wind carried the smell of fuel and the hum of propellers from afar. Overhead, a real C-130 rose into the amber light, its silver body reflecting the sunset. The deep, steady rumble of its engines filled the air, not loud but strong enough to stir the hearts of those who had once heard it in war. The camera followed its flight, panning slowly upward. The frame tightened until only the gray-blue sky remained dimming under the fading glow. A single streak of light trailed behind the aircraft, the trace of a man who had flown away, yet left the sky for others to inherit. As the music deepened, a voice began to narrate, low, warm, and full of feeling. He never needed fame. He never asked for medals or songs. He only needed to know that others still stood tall because he had flown through the storm for them. A man who carried wings heavy with memory and a heart forever bound to the sky he once protected. The music softened, fading into stillness. The camera held its gaze on the heavens. Above, the faint shimmer of a C-130's silhouette lingered among the clouds. Then the closing words came, solemn and unwavering. Krov. Veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. The engines faded into the distance, and at last the screen was left with nothing but the silent sky, a sky of memory, of dignity, and of honor that never fades.